Thank you for joining us here on Around the World. The headlines this hour. French police raid the headquarters of the far-right National Rally Party. Documents linked to a probe into alleged illegal campaign financing were seized. Donald Trump appears to have a change of heart over Ukraine. A day after saying he'd resume weapon shipments to Kyiv, he's now complaining of Vladimir Putin's, quote, bullshit. And a new report out this week that Hamas used sexual violence as a tactical weapon of war during the October 7th attacks. We'll be speaking to the report's co-author in this edition. This Tuesday, a new report came out which establishes that Hamas used sexual violence as a tactical weapon of war during the October 7th attacks. The Dinah Project, which was launched following those horrid events, deems this was part of a genocidal strategy by the militant group. The report, which offers a legal roadmap based on international law, ran into challenges including the scarcity of direct testimony from victims. It's now calling for a shift in how conflict-related sexual violence is prosecuted.
The Dinah report builds on several others by international and Israeli rights groups and concludes that Hamas used sexual violence as a tactical weapon of war motivated by genocidal intent during its October 7th attacks on Israel. The legal team's goal is to pursue justice for its victims.
We carry here a universal message that sexual violence cannot be accepted as a tool of war.
Victims like Delano D'Souza, who was kidnapped from her home on kibbutz near Oz and held hostage for 55 days in Gaza.
I remember guns were pointed at me. I remember hands which did not belong to me touching me. I remember I yelled and then blacked out. When I woke up, I was half naked, surrounded by terrorists. They were beating me, they were touching me. I don't know what happened to my body during those lost minutes, but my soul already knew. Nothing will ever be the same.
The report said witness accounts indicated at least 15 separate cases of sexual assault, with verbal and physical harassment and threats of forced marriage, as well as evidence of gang rape, followed by killing, genital mutilation, and public humiliation.
We formed an evidentiary framework that proves that Hamas used sexual violence in a systematic manner as a weapon of war.
The report calls for wartime sexual violence to be treated differently from regular sex crimes because it said Hamas had silenced most of its victims by killing them. It also said joint criminal responsibility should be applied to all participants in the attack, rather than trying to link individual perpetrators to specific victims. This, it said, would create a pathway to justice for victims of the October 7th attack and potentially for those in other conflict zones. Hamas has denied its forces committed sexual violence against women, but a UN mission concluded last year that there were reasonable grounds to believe that conflict-related sexual violence occurred on October 7th.
I'm really scared.
We can now bring in Ruth Halperin-Kaddari, who co-authored the report and founded the Dinah Project. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today. What prompted you to launch this investigation?
Thank you for having me. Well, it's a question that we are being asked constantly, and I can just reflect back on those horrible days after the most fateful day of October 7 of 2023, and the day after that. Not only myself, but those of us who had experience, professional experience, not personal experience, with sexual violence and knew about sexual violence in conflict, we understood that this was possibly what also took place on October 7 by Hamas against Israel. We, at that time, had no idea of the extent and the scope, but we also immediately understood that there needs to be recognition and justice sought for those victims of the sexual violence of October 7, primarily in the face of the silence, which afterwards turned into denialism by many of international human rights organizations and international women's rights. And we also knew that there is a huge challenge, there's some disturbance in the.
Oh, I'm sorry that because I can hear you perfectly
I'm
fine.
sorry.
We can hear you perfectly fine. You mentioned this denialism. Do you think Israeli women have had a tougher time getting their voices heard than victims of sexual violence elsewhere?
I'm sorry, there is some disturbance and I cannot hear you.
Oh, we're going to try
I'm,
and speak to our audio
I'm
team. And
afraid.
can you hear me now, Ruth?
I'm afraid there was somebody who got online and
Oh, okay.
disturbed and I
Okay,
could
can you
not
hear
hear
me
you.
now?
Yes, I can
Okay,
hear you now.
okay. You were talking about this denialism, and I think that's important because it goes to my next question. Do you think Israeli women have had a tougher time getting their voices heard than victims of sexual violence elsewhere in the West, maybe?
So I think it's a combination. I think that sexual violence in conflict always presents challenges. And we know from international law, we know from experience that there are very, very few indictments, let alone convictions on conflict-related sexual violence. It takes a long time. The challenges of lack of victims who are silenced forever, and the inability to point out to specific perpetrators. This is something that occurs in almost every context when sexual violence is used as a weapon of war. And this was the reason for us developing the legal theory and actually a blueprint that allows for prosecuting all those who took part in such an attack where sexual violence was used as a weapon of war. So this is number one. Number two, sexual violence in conflict is always politicized by different sides to conflict. Having said that, I do believe that the silence on the part of other sisters, women's rights organizations, those who do stand out in other cases of conflict-related sexual violence, and I'm thinking primarily about UN Women, whose role is to defend and to stand for women's rights everywhere in all times, no matter what their nationality is. I think that when this is examined very, very meticulously, we do see a double standard there.
Now, you reviewed a large volume of social media posts, visual and forensic evidence as well. Can you give us some examples and what challenges did you face gathering all this evidence?
So the challenges, as I said, were that most of the victims had been murdered immediately during or after they were assaulted. So they were silenced forever. And then there is no availability to have the witnesses of first-hand witnesses of those who were in fact assaulted on October 7. However, we do have one survivor who did speak about the attempted rape, but the very few other survivors who really survived in Israel are too traumatized to speak. So the key was to find other evidence and find other indications and informations that can serve as evidence in criminal trials and for further investigations. And that is why we point to those 17 eyewitnesses and ear witnesses in real time who themselves are survivors. And for them as well, it took time to step out and to speak about what they had went through and what they had seen.
Were men also subjected to this sexual violence?
To the best of our knowledge, there were also cases of men who were subjected to sexual violence. And we also have to bear in mind that sexual violence in conflict very often does not bear the same form of what we refer to, for lack of a better word, everyday sexual violence. So, for instance, and I'm sorry for going into details, but mutilations of sexual organs, shots into the genitalia, is a recurring pattern of the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. And we have indications that this was also the case on October 7. We also have the testimonies of the returned hostages, including male returning hostages, who do report about various forms of physical and verbal sexual abuse which again do not always conform to what we might have in our perception as what is sexual abuse. But sexual violence in conflict is not directed against the individual per se. And as I said, it very often does not involve rape. It involves other means of destroying the identity, the sexual identity, destroying the personhood, destroying the sexual capacities of the particular individual as he or she symbolizes the whole nation, the body of the whole nation.
I want to talk
Is
about that in
becoming
just a second.
symbolized in the individual.
Because you're calling for a shift in how conflict-related sexual violence is prosecuted. What would you like to see changed?
So, first of all, in the case of October 7, we call upon the Secretary General to include Hamas in the list of those countries and entities and organizations that condone and that use sexual violence as a weapon of war. And in terms of achieving justice, the legal system, broadly speaking, including the Israeli prosecutorial authorities, we call for a paradigm shift in understanding that different means of according responsibility, a criminal responsibility and accountability must be employed in the case of conflict-related sexual violence. Otherwise, there is complete impunity and there cannot be accountability for the perpetrators of these crimes. And the message is terrible. The message is that any terror organization can employ this worst form of crime against humanity and walk away with it because they cannot be prosecuted for lack of victims and for lack of the conventional forensic evidence which are unavailable in these cases.
Ruth, are you optimistic these crimes could potentially be prosecuted by bodies like the International Criminal Court one day? And I only ask because, as you know, authorities, officials where you are, denounce bodies like the International Criminal Court.
So I don't want to go into the political question of where Israel stands vis-a-vis the ICC. I am calling for the Israeli authorities, the prosecutorial authorities in Israel, and we are also speaking on various other levels of justice, including historical justice, setting the record straight. This is also a form of justice and recognition, and also a form of accountability. And this is what we attempted to do in our work in the book that we just handed over yesterday to the First Lady of Israel, Michal Herzog, as was put in the preview story.
Now, you suggested to this, Ruth, that the report by the Dinah Project states that sexual violence was part of Hamas's genocidal strategy. I'm curious, you're a legal expert. Why did you zero in on that word?
Well, when reading Hamas charter and when going through their writings, some of them were found within the vessels of the Hamas terrorists who were captured in Israel following, or in Gaza following October 7. It is clear that the intention in the attack when they entered Israel on October 7 and stormed into civilian places and to civilian population, they had a genocidal intent. The intent was to destroy, to completely dehumanize, and to completely destroy the Israeli people. It is clear in their agenda, in their writings, in their teachings. And this is the indoctrination with which each and every Hamas terrorist came in on October 7, equipped with various weapons, including the, sorry for saying this, but the cheapest weapon available, their own bodies. So this was a genocidal intent, and this is the context in which it has to be prosecuted.
Ruth Halperin-Kaddari, thank you so much for joining us on the program today.